Okay, just a quick intro. I want to thank the students in my class and the other folks that are joining us for coming to hear today's sort of informal conversation hosted by the Center for Global Studies, and more or less focused on, we gave a title to this called "The Challenges and Opportunities of Social Organizing, Nonviolence, Storytelling, Satire, and Solidarity." And today we have two guest speakers. I'll introduce each of them one at a time, but it's Phil Wilmot and Patience Nitumwesiga. We are just excited to have them with us. Unfortunately, they literally were here 2 weeks ago when it snowed. So now they're here through Zoom, which is not the ideal, but still we're making the most of it. So let me start with Phil. Phil is an organizer, movement theorist, writer, educator, and prankster. He co-founded Solidarity Uganda and works with movement support groups like the Global Social Movement Center, Beautiful Trouble, and the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. He's originally from Pennsylvania and is now based at a Pan-African Center for Movement, Training, and Cooperation in Arusha, Tanzania. Nitu is an Afrofuturist storyteller and filmmaker from East Africa. Among her many works are two verite films on African women waging creative nonviolent resistance. Nitu has organized several participatory feminist art projects, such as the Wakiso Femicide Quilt, which unmasked a censored mass homicide against women in her neighborhood, and various satirical short films. She's traveled extensively through East Africa and elsewhere for theater and community work relating to peace and conflict. So please join me in welcoming Phil and Nitu. So I'm just going to start with the way I imagine this is I'm basically asking both of you guys the same question, and you can just decide which one of you answers first, you know. So the first question is just sort of for the class, talk to us about like the trajectory of your life that got you into a moment when you felt like being an activist was your thing, right? How did you get where you are?
You want me to go first? I still don't call myself an activist, although I think most people call me one because it's sort of like a shorthand descriptor. But without going on too much of a rabbit trail about that, I think the world needs normal people to contribute 1 or 2 hours a week in their regular lives to cooperate and struggle together to make things better. So that's why I don't want to kind of like, I think the word activist is kind of, you know, it kind of distances us from mainstream society where power lies, and it can be kind of counterproductive in a way to kind of introduce activist culture as something that we all should be enlisted into. But you know, maybe to more directly answer the question about the trajectory of our lives, for me, growing up in small town Pennsylvania, I could sense from a very young age that I was being sheltered from the questions of the world that really mattered. I don't know if anybody, maybe raise your hand if you kind of feel what I'm saying when I say that. I don't know if any of you grew up in similar situations, but you know, I think I attribute a lot to honestly being at university. I went to Messiah University, just outside Harrisburg, and got a lot involved in like the housing and homeless kind of communities and in a kind of greater Harrisburg. And this was around the time that the Occupy Wall Street movement was coming up. So I was kind of studying, you know, movement theorists in a formal academic setting. I was part of like the pro-Palestine group and other kinds of like peace groups and anti-war groups on campus. And then this kind of movement against corporatocracy was rising in the US and elsewhere. And I was part of like actually, I was the first day that Occupy Harrisburg went to occupy the Capitol building in Pennsylvania. I was present among a small group of people, and we ended up being the second longest standing occupation in the entire Occupy Wall Street movement globally. So, you know, I was kind of like involved in this and that. I was getting my hands dirty, making a lot of mistakes, asking a lot of tough questions. And these tough questions led me to study in Uganda and East Africa. And I noticed really quickly how, you know, US foreign policy and generally colonialism and imperialism continue to affect the world. And of course, this is what, to keep a very long story short, this is how Nitumwesiga and I know each other, is because I studied there and sort of ended up around in the struggle against Uganda's dictatorship. So maybe I can just stop there and you can jump in.
Yeah, so our journeys are a little bit different because I went to theater school, and after that, I wanted to work with communities using theater. But I was very frustrated for a long time because we received a lot of funding that dictated what kind of issues we talked about in the communities. But I was also frustrated with the lack of follow through. You know, you go to a community with a project and you're there for a year or two and then you're out, and that's the end of it. So I wanted to be part of, I was very influenced by Paulo Freire, for instance, and I wanted to be part of the community deciding what happens to them and what do they want to do, and conscientization and ownership and all those things. And then I think a few years ago, it just, for me, it just happened to me that like being a documentary filmmaker is right now like sort of what I feel like is my purpose, because I wanted to be in the room documenting people that are doing exactly what I thought was missing. And the few people, the stories that I tell, you know, for instance, are stories about people that are involved in communities and are part of a decolonized struggle, because a lot of funding into, you know, community work in East Africa, especially where based, is very influenced by where the funding is coming from and what issues they care about. And I would see, for instance, the film that I'm working on currently, if you see the news from Al Jazeera or BBC, it paints a very different picture of, you know, these East Africans and what their issues. And I wanted to be part of the people who are like, no, this is our story, and this is how we choose to go against, you know, colonization or whatever it is. And I think that became like a turning point in my life when I was like, oh, I can do that. I may not be the person that goes to a march and, you know, or, you know, goes to the UN and does whatever, but I can be the person that documents it, because that part of the struggle was missing, because people who came to document those stories were coming in from a very Western lens. Yeah.
Okay, so that helps us get to my next question, which is, could each of you describe the current projects you're involved with?
Yeah, you can go first.
Okay, so the current film that I'm working on, which is in post-production, is a film about a Ugandan queer rights activist, academic, and poet who went to jail for offending Uganda's dictator of about 4 decades. And so the film starts following her soon after she leaves jail. And she decides, because everybody expected that since she's been in jail for about 18 months, she's going to be, you know, cooled down and not wanting to protest. And she comes out of jail and declares that she's going to run for parliament. So we, you know, follow her through that campaign. And how brutal it was and how it weighs hard on her family until it's too unsafe for her and she has to go into exile in Germany. So it's called The Woman Who Poked the Leopard. It's probably going to come out at the end of this year, and hopefully it will be showing somewhere in the States. Yeah.
Yeah, Pesha's always kind of working on 4 or 5 story-related, arts-related, projects that overlap with various aspects of social and political struggle. My life is a bit unique and strange, I think. I spent so much time as a grassroots kind of like community organizer, campaigning and, waging actions and resistance on all kinds of issues. Now I'm kind of like in this really kind of obscure position where my like professional work is salaried to kind of like coach people to do what I've been doing. So I work at a center in Arusha, Tanzania, a center that's been there since the late 60s. So it's been around kind of as a refuge for people in political struggles to come and, regroup, re-strategize, come up with something and go back to their worlds and to their communities and their lives and make a change. So I work a lot with the community organizers and getting them the different kinds of support that they need. Sometimes it's strategic or educational kind of in nature. Other times it's money for A, B, C, or D. Other times it's kind of like emergency, jail solidarity, crisis response kind of stuff for people who disappear. So, it's quite eclectic, the kinds of needs that people around the world, and in particular in Africa for my work, usually in Africa anyway, the kinds of needs that they have are just, all across the spectrum. And we have to be kind of like agile and nimble as a small team of 3 at this center to find ways to support them. And, part of it has to do with like knowledge. And this is kind of where Sophia and I were able to connect, because a lot of her research is around some particular aspects of movement strategy and tactics. So, I've been working with a lot of these kinds of similar questions. And so that's how we got to know each other. But I think as an individual, lately, it's been a lot of kind of like finding the companies in Pennsylvania that are supporting Israel's occupation of Palestine and trying to undermine those companies. That's kind of like the more recent project. And, support to different kinds of grassroots resistance groups back home in Uganda that are resisting the dictatorship, just trying to get them the different kinds of support that they need. I think those are like the 2 currently like personal things that I'm really invested in outside of kind of like my formal job and this kind of thing.
So the class that your talk is connected to is a conflict resolution class. And a lot of the class focuses on why that's hard. I think I depress them most of the time. So what I was hoping you might be able to do is, if you can tell 1 or more stories of a time when you had a win, right? What did it look like? What did that process, in some kind of detail, if you can, some moment of success to share with the students?
Sure. I got one. You want to think of one too? I'll start. So, okay, so one of the, depending on how you look at it, one of the cool or not so cool things about conflict resolution in Pennsylvania is that you can just kind of slap a sign on your front door that says, I'm a conflict mediator. I don't know if the requirements have changed, but I remember kind of like going through some certifications in the state of Pennsylvania for conflict resolution, and the facilitator was like, you don't even need this, but since you're taking it also as a university class, we'll just take you through the certification. So it's quite a diverse kind of an interesting kind of thing to go through. But it all has to do with power. And there's this kind of paradox in social change, because on one hand, you want to be very biased. You believe in X, the other team believes in Y, and you're trying to shift things more toward X. Within mediation, if that's what we're talking about in conflict resolution, you kind of withdraw your interests. You know, if you can be as neutral as possible, in many cases, you'll be a better mediator and help people. Instead of arbitrating for them, you kind of help them to arrive ideally at their mutually agreed upon way forward. So this is kind of like an interesting thing in politics as well, where you have, or I should say in political struggle, you have, you know, communities that are pulling toward those opposite sides. You know, part of the community wants this, part of the community wants that. And you're kind of pulling against each other, and at the same time, you're part of the same community. So it's a very complicated thing. I kind of had to navigate some of this complexity in 2014. We had a just kind of like an embezzlement corruption crisis within the healthcare sector of the town that I was living in. And this was in northern Uganda. And so, you know, we kind of like organized a lot of, you know, protests and different kinds of actions. We kept getting arrested. And at some point, it became less about like the corruption scandals within the health sector and more just about like the consistent police brutality that we were up against. So, you know, we kind of decided we needed to figure out a way to like socially ostracize the police bosses in our town. Because if we could do that, then they wouldn't have any kind of like local legitimacy to continue their work. And if we could show that distrust, then we knew that that would drive a wedge between them and their superiors, because their superiors in the capital city are sort of expecting them to, you know, keep society in line for the ruling party. And if it's perceived that they're unable to do that, then like their job is on the line, you know? And at the same time, we're not trying to kind of like ignite so much that they bring like the full force of a military dictatorship against us. So it's like this really kind of tricky, you know, tightrope to balance on, right? So one of the things that we did after one arrest was to throw a like a party for the people who fed us and entertained us and basically gave us hospitality. That was kind of the phrase that we were using while we were detained. So that included the officer in charge of the particular police station where we were detained for about a week. It was an illegal detention beyond the constitutionally permitted 48 hours. So it also kind of reflected bad on him that we were, you know, bringing this up again, that he, you know, violated his own laws that he's trying to use against us. So we invited this guy as a guest of honor, which is kind of like this prestigious thing that's supposed to ceremoniously happen at any kind of like public function. So he, when he showed up at the event, first of all, we thought, you know, maybe he's not going to show up. And then that's also kind of like a sign that we have, you know, more legitimacy and that he's afraid of us, you know. But if he does show up, it's sort of up to him, you know. Is he going to try to apologize and reconcile? Is he going to, you know, passively enjoy the event and pretend that we're not doing something snarky against him? When he came with like tear gas and all kinds of stuff, and he shut down the party. So within 4 days, he was like transferred to another district, which is essentially like what Pennsylvania would call a county. So this was like a big win for the community, because he had not only affected us, but he kind of had this really kind of wild, unhinged kind of personality, and he was affecting all kinds of people in the community who are even doing completely apolitical stuff. So for the community, that was like a big win, you know, just transferring him out of the district. And the next two officers in charge of that station that were assigned were also pushed out by the same kind of community group that was organizing these actions. So there have been a few towns in our network where it's very difficult for a police boss to stay there for long if they're choosing to kind of disrupt the community and, you know, not listen to the whatever the the community wants to run things. So I think that's like one of the for me personally, that was like one of the times that we could see like a tangible win, you know. Of course, there's still a long way to go regarding police brutality, but that was like one concrete, tangible win and a small battle, small step. Do you have any examples or thoughts to share?
I think there's like a small story that I can share about the character in my film. At one point, she was teaching at Makerere University, and she had this long battle going on between her and the university because they were asking her to do more work than she was contracted to do. And she had this very patriarchal head of department that was just like constantly getting on her nerves and asking her to do more work, which she refused to do. And they had huge piles of files. You know, she requested the university council, the university head of like the committee that's in charge of matters that relate to staff, and it just went on and on for a long time. So this one time she decided, okay, I think they stopped paying her. The guy decided to stop paying her and like froze her salary. So what she did is she went to the department's entrance, she locked herself in, and she stripped naked. And the police came and wanted to arrest her, and they were like, you know, you're being so immoral, and accusing her of all those things. And I remember like this one statement that she makes about, all this time I've been asking, I sent so many letters to police, I sent so many letters to the university council asking for help against this man that's just refusing to pay me, refusing to, you know, honor my contract. None of you came, but suddenly I'm undressed and you're here because of, and I think she uses that sort of like traditional scandal, sort of the shock value of it, yes, but she uses vulgarity and nudity to sort of call to attention things that have gone on for so long. And she calls it radical rudeness, but in a way it's something that, you know, she said helps her when everything else has failed. It's like a last resort thing that you wouldn't employ every day. But she says, you know, this one time, after years and years of just battling back and forth, finally everybody came and they opened her office and started paying her after she decided to strip naked.
That's a great story. It connects with some of the research that I've been doing, where the idea is that the intervention or the prank is actually the mirror of the thing you're protesting. So the radical rudeness is the system, right? But I have to be naked for you to recognize it, right? I have to do this thing, this big gesture, so that you can see this thing that I can see easily, and you need help, right? Connecting with. So it's always that other side of it, right? Anyway, all right. So my next question is, as you guys look at the work that you're doing and the types of change and you know, sort of progressive energy you're putting towards your various projects, tell us a little bit about the challenges and the opportunities that you see in the current moment for, you know, the things that you're invested in.
Okay, challenges are so many. I could spend a whole day talking about the challenges. I mean, the world is getting definitely more fascist, more one of the things that led to the loss of the election for my main participant for my film is that she, for instance, publicly supported the struggle for queer people in Uganda. And in Uganda, there's, you know, a lot of people were hoping she'd just pretend that this is not an issue. And for all that they knew that she stood for, you know, she's someone that's fought for them even before she wanted to run for parliament. So we went to communities where they were like, we know how hard you've fought without a salary. So we know if you go to parliament, definitely you're going to stand, you know, for us, and you're going to be our voice. But this one little thing about, you know, all this money that's coming into, for instance, our countries from, you know, American evangelical churches and stuff like that, you know, this fear about some form of, I don't know, gay agenda or something that's feared to be out there, you know, stops people from seeing anything beyond that. So I think one of the challenges is like this neo-colonization through ideas and fear, and it's just like standing in the way of people. And I hate it, especially being a Ugandan, because I know how radical Ugandan society can be. But now, you know, the international society just looks at Uganda as, oh, the country that hates the gays. But, you know, the fact that we're not able to move on from things like that, and that they stand in the way for so much progress, I think it's been hard having conversations to move forward to decolonize ourselves because of, you know, like that kind of money that comes in, that kind of colonization, those ideas that are coming in through the church and other, you know, sort of avenues where a dictator like Museveni is able to stay in power because he promises them, oh, the gays will never take over in Uganda, you know, there'll never be. So that's a bit sad to see that, you know, a lot of people get twisted, a lot of really ideally radical people that, you know, just stop thinking when it comes to a few of those, you know, things. But I think for me, what I see as an opportunity is the ability to sort of present and document people that are in the struggle alongside communities like that. I always tell, you know, people when they ask me like, why did you tell the story of this woman? And I'm like, if I wrote, because I also write fiction, if I wrote a character that looks and talks like Stella, my character in the documentary, everybody will be like, no, this is not an African woman, because outside of, you know, what people know is Ugandans just, you know, are this and that, and there's boxes that have our countries from the global south have sort of been put into. And so the opportunity is to present someone as breathing and living as Stella. She's a very radical woman. She's Ugandan. She's very traditional. Some of her protest, I don't want to call them tricks, but methodology comes from traditional Kiganda society, and she uses that. She's a very well accomplished scholar, so she knows what she's working with. And so for me, the opportunity is to be like, look here, you know, Ugandans are not all, you know, thinking in this colonized one box kind of way. It's to present people from the global south that are very radical and very breathing and living. And it was important to me to document that while she's still alive. And I mean, I like the idea of documenting people that are still alive and whose words and ethics are still present in the process of documenting the film, you know, as opposed to just documenting someone who just passed away and there's like a history documentary. So I like the opportunity of being on that journey and witnessing a person that's refusing to sort of give in to this resigned way of looking at the world that, you know, the colonizer won. Yeah.
I think, you know, Nitumwesiga has talked about like definitely some of the challenges. Of course, like the climate crisis is imminent. It's already something that we're living with, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be getting better anytime soon, and quite the opposite perhaps. So, you know, there's reason to be kind of mournful and grieving like this historical moment. There's the climate paralleled with, you know, a rise in militarism, in many places, a rise in fascism. So there's like all these kind of things that can really weigh on people, and I'm one of those people. For me, I think I'm hopeful that, you know, when I see the kinds of questions our children ask, these are questions that I didn't ask until my mid-20s, you know. So if anybody can do it, you know, it's kind of like, I get really frustrated when my elders like pass down burdens onto me. So I'm really hesitant to say this, but I do think, you know, if anyone can do it, it's my kids, you know. But we do have kind of a few generations now that have many people among them that are really trying to do things a little bit differently than their parents. And in shifting like how we see the world, what kinds of questions we ask, what are our values, you know? So there is kind of a cultural shift within, for lack of a better term, the masses, you know, the people of the world. But parallel to that positive shift is this really small elite minority of very wealthy billionaires that are extremely connected to all forms of power. And so those are two very powerful forces. And there are no guarantees, you know, but the best thing that we can do is to try, you know, to, you know, hope is not this like whimsical thing that floats out there and we just sort of, in some ethereal sense, try to pretend that it exists and we're going to end up in a better place automatically. Like, it's, if you have hope, you act on it, you try to grab it, you try to take action with it. And you know, the kind of like classic question in like especially like North American or yeah, like our continent's, you know, kind of forms of community organizing has been, if not me, then who? Right? Like if somebody's going to change this thing, if not me, then who? And obviously it's a rhetorical question. It's me. Like we have to figure out the way to change these things. Let me not go off onto a tangent about Eric Olin Wright's, you know, sociological theories and whatnot. Back to you guys.
Thank you. I want to mention to patients that one of the books that we'll be reading in this class is about global homophobia. And if you're at all interested, I can send it to you. It's a really compelling set of essays that helps you see the rise of weaponized homophobia as a direct response to certain patterns of neocolonialism, but particularly also neoliberalism. So it's just the classic distract from this other thing, but the essays are global and it's really, really cool, really interesting. And there's a lot of stuff that deals particularly with what's happened with homophobia in Africa. So if you want, after this, I'll get it to you if you're curious about it. I'm just going to ask one more question and then I'm going to open it up because I know that there's probably people who are remote or in the room who also have questions. So the last question that I'll put to you guys has to do particularly with your experience and what you've seen as effective tactics. As Phil pointed out, that's how we started to get to connect with my interest in what types of methods are, you know, really effective. And in particular with my interest in humor and satire and pranking as something that can really sort of destabilize narratives and get change to happen. So can you each talk to me a little bit about your experience in trying to use more creative types of tactics and which ones you've seen that, you know, maybe an example or two of something that really worked? Obviously, Phil, if you want to talk about Beautiful Trouble, that would be cool too.
Okay.
You go first.
Well, maybe I can start by saying that I have a question for all of you to think about in the meantime as I try to answer this question, which is, why did you take this class? And yeah, like what are some of like your interests? Because the more specific we can be, hopefully with this limited time together, you know, we want to be kind of like available for your kind of questions and interests. So that's a question for you all. So I think like one thing that I try to be very careful of in like advising and supporting and being a part of different, you know, social movements, political struggles, campaigns, trade unions, especially in contexts that are where the infrastructure of social democracy either totally doesn't exist or it only exists as a facade. And there's a discussion to be had about where the US stands in that question too, among other, you know, so-called developed or industrialized nations. But I really try to be careful of centering anger and just kind of like the normative activist kind of, you know, persona. When you think of an activist, you think of this like angry person who's always preaching too hard about issue A, B, C, D, and you just kind of get tired. You don't like, even before you meet them or hang out with them, you're already tired, you know? So a lot of people are legitimately angry, and we can't and shouldn't suppress that anger. It's even useful and strategic. It's natural, you know, it's human, about the things that they're facing or that others are facing. So, you know, it's not to kind of like erase that, because protest and kind of that traditional activism has a place, and it's legitimate, but it's not responded to well. You know, power is a game of numbers, among other things. You're trying to get other people involved. You're trying to get people to be more committed. You're trying to get people to not run away, to be involved for the long haul. So there needs to be some community building, some, you know, sustaining our network, our friends, you know. There needs to be relationships and trust. So it's more than just the ingredients of like hitting the streets with a bunch of signs, trying to block a little traffic, trying to get into the newspapers about the issue that you're mad about. So that's useful sometimes, but usually we can be more creative and think kind of like more strategically about what other options we have. The first kind of like, well, maybe like the first super systematic effort to kind of codify like a huge list of tactics came from Gene Sharp, who passed away a few years back. And maybe you've heard about him in your class or otherwise. So he wrote famously the list of 198 nonviolent methods, which are basically tactics. And then, you know, there have been different projects throughout since his time, and I think that was published in like the early mid-70s, if I'm not mistaken. So there's been some efforts since his time to kind of expand this, to add nuance to it, to address some of Gene Sharp's blind spots, et cetera, et cetera. They're kind of like new generations of like activist toolkits. So I had the privilege to develop one of these. If you go to beautifultrouble.org, you can click on the thing that says toolbox, and you'll be able to kind of sift through. You'll see tactics, principles, stories, theories, and methodologies for social change, basically. And, you know, we use this, it's a very modular thing. You don't read it from cover to cover. You kind of look for what you want within that database that might be relevant or helpful to the issue that you're working on. And, you know, we work with all kinds of groups all around the world, trying to get them to ask more creative and strategic questions about how are we going to get victory? How are we going to get closer to victory? Of course, like no one tactic is like a silver bullet. You're always looking for some kind of combination, given the particulars of your group, the particulars of your context, the nature of the political system, economic system, et cetera, in your particular area, the social dynamics. You know, you need to ask all these kind of strategic questions. So, you know, people that go to learn about war and the dynamics of war and strategies of war, they take, you know, years and years and years to graduate from college, grad school. You know, we have doctors that are making, you know, all kinds of really dangerous weapons, you know, because they're highly intelligent and trained, right? but we don't have these institutions around the world for nonviolent resistance, for creative pranks, right? We don't have that same infrastructure to get disciplined and that kind of thing, nor will it pay, right? There's no taxpayer fund that's gonna bottom line our salaries to do this stuff, right? So we wanted at least to have a resource there that people that lack that infrastructure can use and get in touch with us to help them use if they feel stuck. As just like, you know, a starting point to be a little bit more strategic and creative. Over to you, Nitu.
I mean, I think you have a lot of tactics. So just so you don't get too tired of me talking about my character in my film, I'm gonna read 2 stanzas of a poem that she wrote on Facebook. And this is to sort of talk about like how I'm obsessed with some of the disruptive methods that she uses, because this poem, I think if she had written like the most eloquent, you know, poem about how Museveni is a dictator, it would have still passed, you know, through so many people's feeds. She's very well followed. She has hundreds of thousands of followers on social media. So she uses that. And this is just two stanzas of a poem that she wrote. There's going to be 2 names. One is Yoweri, which is the first name of the president of Uganda, Museveni. And the other name is Esiteri, which is the name of Museveni's mother. And here goes the poem. Yoweri, they say it was your birthday yesterday. How bitterly sad a day. I wish the smelly and itchy cream-colored candida festering in Esteri's cunt had suffocated you to death during birth. Suffocated you just like you are suffocating us with oppression, suppression, and repression. Yoweri, they say it was your birthday yesterday. How painfully ugly a day. I wish the lice-filled bush of dirty pubic hair, overgrown all over Esiteri's unwashed choo-choo, had strangled you at birth, strangled you just like the long tentacles of corruption you sowed and watered into our bleeding economy. So the poem is very long, but it describes in great detail how this president's mother's vagina should have just killed him at birth, or else the country would be better. So the reason that I like it, and I think it worked and it took her to jail, is because, you know, it's not just about writing the truth. It's about using some images that, you know, disrupt. And everybody was like, you are so vulgar. How dare you? And her charge was offending the president and his mother. So it's like, you're making a joke of, you know, the whole state, like, you know, it's easy to just be like, okay, I'm going to write the most well-written piece about this dictatorship. But I love the way she chooses, you know, vulgarity and sexual imagery, because she knows it will grab people and it will, you know, disrupt the flow. So it's my favorite, she's my favorite disruptor. And, you know, it's the one tactic that I think sometimes works and has worked definitely in her case. Yeah.
We're going to open things up to some questions here. I think you should come up because probably the sound won't work so well. Who's coming?
Hi. So I've done some like community organizing myself, specifically around gun violence and stuff like that. And I just wanted to ask, since there's a lot of like sacrifice that goes into community organizing and like activist work in general. So do you think it's worth it, or do you think like you'll see the fruits of your labor basically?
Want to start?
You start.
Well, thanks for your commitment. Yeah, I mean, it's always, there are always fruits of the labor. Sometimes they're not the goal that you set out to achieve. But I've met community organizers all around the world, and I don't think I've ever actually met anybody that says, I regret this. I mean, I've met a few people that engaged in kind of like activisty things, and then they got arrested and they sort of disappeared. But people that do community organizing, in particular, I mean, the building relationships and all that kind of thing, I've seen so many people grow, so many people develop new, very meaningful friendships, with, common values. I've seen, subtle shifts and big shifts in communities as a result of this. So I highly doubt you'll regret doing it. One person from New Zealand was sharing with me how they tried to get a speed bump at a place that had a few accidents. And this took like 3 years, right? A group of maybe like 8 or 12. Usually it's like 10, give or take a few people that form kind of like a core group working on an issue. And so, they got all the community involved and all this and that. And then after the 3 years, they kind of reflected on, they're like, that took us 3 years just to get a speed bump. What are we going to do next? Like what we have to kind of level up, right? I think one of the famous images, if you want to read about community organizing, I recommend Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. It's kind of like a classic text. I have a PDF if there's no other way to find it, but one of the images that Saul Alinsky, who organized with all kinds of communities, especially across the US, one of the kind of like images that he shares is that of like a mountain. So you're like climbing up this mountain, you kind of like get to the first peak and the clouds clear and you're like, finally I've reached. And then you just see that there's like another mountain. And so it has to be worth the climb. And I think I wish, I don't really like memorize poetry, but there's one that I can share with Sophia to share with you all about it's a Latino poet that talks about utopia and kind of like this idea that utopia is on the horizon. I take 10 steps forward, and then it seems like it's 12 steps further away from me. I take another 5 steps, and then it just seems further and further away. So if utopia is good for anything, it's good for walking, right? So there has to be that element of like, is this rewarding for me? Is this feeding my self-interest as a human, as an individual, and within our community? There will definitely be times that you do things you don't want to do, you make sacrifices, things feel really bleak, mental health challenges, depression. I've gone through all these kind of things more than once, but I never really look back on anything I've done and I can say like that was completely a waste of my time, that I regret doing that. I think that to be human means that we need to be in community with each other. We need to cooperate together. We need to find a way to make life meaningful together. And right now, gun violence is one of those things that's making life way less meaningful. It's standing in the way. It's obstructing our ability to enjoy the beauty of life on Earth, So find ways, I would suggest, to inject beauty into that space of community organizing that you're doing. That's never a distraction or a hindrance from the real work. So don't allow yourself to believe that, the real serious stuff is like only where we can quantify our victory and our progress. That's not true, One of the groups that I'm not too familiar with it, but I'm just like kind of inspired by its existence, is a group called Moms in Action. I don't know if they're still in action, but the idea was kind of like, these suburban soccer mom minivan driving, moms in pretty privileged parts of America, getting together and working on gun violence, kind of in a cheeky or snarky way, like undermining that whole kind of like archetypal suburban soccer mom character, and saying like, actually we have power and there's a problem right now in our schools and we can get together and make a change, So finding ways to kind of uplift things, while not overlooking like the serious grief and you know, challenges. We have to be there for all of that as well. The full spectrum of human emotions has to be there. What can you add? I'm sure you have some wisdom on this.
And no, I totally agree. But the only thing I can add is that what's important is to find a community of people who think like you. We recently met a couple of Black Panthers that are exiled in Tanzania, and are not able, one of them is not able to come back to the US, and they've gone through like some really tough stuff. And as everyone knows, you know, a lot of activists go through a lot of very traumatic, you know, things. And I remember asking them, like, have you had therapy, and have you had any way to work on your state of mind? And they told me the only thing that really worked is to find people who believe in the same things and just meet for a few days and like be with each other and vent to each other and just like calm, you know, each other down. So I think a lot of people would want to give up. And if you're alone, obviously it's going to look like it's easier to just let it go. But if you have people who think like you and want a better world and you know, are there to sort of keep refueling you, I think it becomes a little bit easier, because it isn't easy. So I think community is like a big, I mean, you can get therapy, yes, but I think having people around you who believe in the same values that you do goes a long way.
And finally, maybe let me also add, whatever the most trashy thing is that you like, find some friends that really like that thing and spend time with them on a regular basis doing that thing. Sans politics, don't talk about anything serious, just like whatever that trashy thing is, enjoy it with, you know, have that space as well.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, cool. So what are some issues and maybe some solutions you've found when engaging with, I guess, long-term organization and movements in like anti-fascist and anti-imperial movements? Because these are long projects, and it's really easy, I think, to kind of get discouraged and kind of see like, I mean, as you were talking about, like it's a long path, a lot of walking. So what are some kind of solutions that you've maybe found that help you keep that momentum?
One of the things that I really appreciate about the consciously kind of like anarchist groups that I've had the privilege to be with is that they want to step away from dominant society and create an alternative. I helped start a few commune houses and things like that, you know, where we do food and decision making and, you know, kind of like the weekly rituals and this kind of stuff a little bit differently, and create those more autonomous kind of spaces. I think that is very insufficient in political struggle, but it's also like needed for our humanity. And not everybody really has that as like a main kind of like component of their strategy, you know. Trade unions, for example, like it's built out of this idea that most of our lives are spent at work in the industrial or post-industrial kind of world. Like we're all just always at work, so we might as well struggle together at work. And I think where a lot of the kind of like anarchist groups differentiate from that is they say, you know, life is not all about productivity. You know, we can kind of create an alternative community on our terms, at least to some extent, you know, to create the world that we want. And it is kind of like this, in movement kind of movement theory, there's this kind of paradox that's often talked about. It's been talked about for a few hundred years now, which is like, are we the change that we want to, must we make the change we want to see, or are we the change we want to see? And the answer is yes, it's both, right? So both and. Where do you situate your own center of gravity amidst that kind of spectrum is like a question worthy of all kinds of reflection. don't think I'm really like directly addressing your question, but I appreciate the complexity behind it.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to say to that. It is hard to keep like the momentum going, but again, you know, to sort of go back to like what you were saying, it's, you know, part of creating those circles that keep you not just accountable, but just keep you refueled, I guess, in your personal life as well. Because part of my findings in trying to document these, you know, some people try to call them human rights defenders and all kinds of names, is that they don't put a lot of time on personal lives. It's, you know, about, you know, yeah, the change that needs to happen. But how about you as a person? How about, you know, your health, your well-being, your personal well-being? I think that's the often neglected part of, you know, an activist's life. And they center on and it's all important to focus on the big picture, but I think the person that you are also needs some nurturing and some time away. And then when you come back, because there's a lot of burnout, there's a lot of burnt out activists out there, and I think it's in everyone's best interest to just take time off, be yourself, get what you need, and then come back.
So, I mean, one of the greatest myths of like neoliberalism is that we are all individuals and can be kind of like atomized as such. And then when there's a problem, we sort of blame it on us. If you can think about the culture that like over generations has been built up in the US of like blaming the poor for their problems, blaming the homeless for not having a house, you know, there's this kind of like ideology is like deeply embedded in our history and culture. So, you know, one of the greatest things that we can do is to figure out how can we build systems of interdependence that actually sustain us, create the alternatives that we need. I think, you know, this idea of it being long-term work, yes, it's true. And also, going back to something I said earlier, like we don't need superheroes, you know, there are no individual superheroes in this thing. We need regular, normal people, might not even be totally politically, you know, conscious or something, that can give a few hours a day or a few hours a week, you know, to like meeting together, making decisions in a more horizontal and cooperative way, trying to figure out solutions to the challenges they identify in their communities. I mean, that's how over the long term, we shift culture a bit, we shift, you know, society a bit toward that more people, you know, people ownership of decisions, or, you know, some people use the term democratic, as opposed to kind of like representative democracy where we elect and indirectly in that way run our world. But that more kind of like truly community-based kind of way of doing things. It's a long haul, but again, it's just have that kind of lens of like the individual is an abstraction. This is about getting people to cooperate and build power through making decisions together about the things that affect them. I can see Edwin has shared a link also in the chat.
Yeah, Edwin, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you shared?
I think it's in reference to what Patience was talking about. Dr. Stella Nyaz, it's a piece of article that was written by a Penn State professor. So it's very interesting to look at in regards to what she was talking about.
Thank you. Did you want to ask a question too?
Yes, if I may. Yeah, thank you very much. Patience and Phil, thank you very much for your presentation and for the work that you do. I was born and raised and grew and studied in Uganda. And so I understand the situation, the conditions, the hard, tough times that, you know, the kind of work that you do requires more than, you know, what us normal folks do. And so it's incredible to see the work that you continue to do, and I wanted to, to praise you for that and to encourage you to go on. I have two questions, one for Patience and Phil. Patience, given the conditions in Uganda and the work that you do, I've just watched Bobby Wine's documentary, the National Geographics, and so I want to highlight the importance of the work that you do, documenting Dr. Stella's work. But you as a person, given the situation where Uganda is at, given the historical context of Uganda, I mean, when we go back into the time of Idi Amin, and looking at the time when President Museveni came to power, with the hopes that everybody was looking at this is now the good time that we're entering in the 86 and so and towards the 90s, but also to see how he has unfolded. And then we see the same structure of things happening across the region. And you can talk about Rwanda, DRC, Congo, you can talk about other regions, and then we end up having this club of these, old men and, dictators who are autocrats who are coming up and shaping the governments around them as individuals, disregarding the state functions and systems that we have in power. Now, my question is, do you think that's going to change in the near future? Is there a possibility that we might have this person, another new person coming in and becoming the same individual in the future? Because that's the same system that we see Museveni came up, rose through the ranks, people trusted him, rallied behind him, went to the bush, fought, gave their lives, and now we see what has happened over the years. And plus then we see activists like Chiza Besigye coming in, Mugisha Muntu and the likes, now Bobby Wine, and then Museveni using the state, infrastructure to destroy, people, activists who are going into the system. So do you see hope? Do you have faith that we might get someone different? Or we might rally behind somebody who might come in and become the same person? And two, do you think the young people that you see today in your interaction are capable of turning the tide? Because from I have some discussions with, my friends I went to school with, most of them, when you're having conversations with them, are now tied into the government rhetoric of quick money, quick bucks. I'm chasing this deal. I have $1 million project coming in. They are all focused on what's coming from the government. And so that kind of have deteriorated the systems of governance we have and the hopes and aspirations of the community to the individual, what I can get, what I can take away, and what is it. And to feel, I was just wondering from your own experience where you see democratic infrastructure decay on the continent, and particularly in the region. We see that in Uganda now, where you have any infrastructure. I can say from my experience, I've seen working from police, to state ministries. If you don't bribe somebody, you don't get a service. Mm-hmm. And so when you come in as an outsider, in Uganda, especially where now the rhetoric is, you're bringing in Western ideas and ideals to us, we can define our own society. We see the attack there when it comes to different ideas coming in. How do you find that space to be able to construct or help or guide organizations or individuals on the ground where you are seen as an outsider? That then when you come, are you trying to dictate or bring in your ideas enforced on us? And how does that help us, especially where we need that to help us learn and see, and in a way which is dangerous because it kills the idealism of discussion, of debate, of learning, that now we come up, the community, society is just growing up with, no. This is now the colonial master coming back and telling us what we, how we should run our society or do. And then we use that, most of these countries use that to rally the society, the community behind them, that we are fighting them, in that scale. Thank you.
I think, Ugandan people are scared people. People don't realize that Uganda has never had peaceful transition of power since the British left. And I think dictators use that, people use that because Ugandans are scared of war, because they've gone through so many wars in the name of their liberation that they don't want it anymore. And so if the dictator says, if you keep me in power, there will be no bloodshed, they will keep him in power. And I think that's why Dr. Stella's work is important, because it brings, Stella critiques even opposition leaders that begin to look like the dictator. And part of why she lost the vote is she's not scared of criticizing fellow opposition leaders and saying, you're not doing this the right way. We don't want another Museveni in power. We need a person that will be aligned with the people and not a person that's thinking about power. So I think my hope is in, and my manifestation of hope is in putting my faith behind people like, you know, Stella, even though right now she can't go back to Uganda, but there is other people. And my own, you know, personal belief is that we need voices like that, that will critique every person that's misusing power, even if they claim to be on the side of the people, but are taking advantage. And when you have masses of people that are scared, and I believe there's a lot of other people in the world who are just scared because you have the guns, you have the power, and you can just like obliterate them in a second. So they are willing to do things that otherwise, you know, that they don't want, because they're scared of just, you know, death. Who isn't? So I think it's good to have voices that are feminist in, you know, in the conversation, because we like to pretend that, you know, as long as somebody, I mean, Ugandans would have anyone, I think, other than Museveni, because they're tired of him. But I do believe in the need to critique whoever is coming into power. In Gambia, for instance, they had this beautiful, successful revolution, and then they didn't think about the next person they're putting in power. And now the guy that they put in power is, you know, almost worse than the guy that they got out of power. So I think we're learning in the process of, we're new countries also, like people don't think about that. They call us democracies, but we're really not democracies. We're just learning how this Western democracy works. That's not how our politics worked. So I think the voices that keep criticizing people, reminding them that there are alternative ways to doing things the way that they're done, are very important. And I think that's something to put faith in. Yeah.
So I'll answer, I mean, Edwin, thanks a lot. And maybe just to get a show of hands, has anybody else seen this Bobby Wine documentary that Edwin referred to? I think it's worth watching. I mean, like we can have our own critiques, and it doesn't really center a lot of the kind of like grassroots organizing and that kind of thing. We have our own maybe like issues like as people involved in making films, but I think it's really like a good window into the sort of conflict between Museveni and the major opposition leaders in Uganda. It gives you an image, it paints an image at least of the, you know, the militarism of Uganda's dictatorship. It doesn't get as much into like the US backing and other, you know, kind of imperial forces involved, but it touches on that a little bit. But I think it's a good kind of like starter if you're interested in learning about kind of like politics in East Africa. I'll answer the two questions that Edwin posed to me. One about where is there still democratic infrastructure in East Africa? The other one about my involvement in movement life as sort of like an outsider or an immigrant or an adopted person, let's say. So about the democratic infrastructure, I mean, East Africa is one of the most democratic regions of the world. Every decision historically, not every, but many decisions historically have been rooted in communities. They've been pulled together through things like barazas, you know, where communities gather under a nice shade tree, spend the day talking about their challenges and what they're going to do next. They're not perfect. Yes, people who are younger are marginalized in those conversations. Yes, people of particular genders are marginalized in those conversations, et cetera, but there is some attempt at, or some semblance or tradition of direct democracy at play there. And still, it's very much alive in many of the parts of East Africa. There are many cases where
Rwanda used those. Yeah.
Rwanda as well.
Yeah.
there are many cases where communities have basically made a decision for themselves, which even violated, knowingly or not, national law. And operatives of the state have even been at these meetings and not even said anything. So that shows you that, there might be this sort of de jure power, like whatever the law says, it's like this and trickle down, blah, blah, blah. But there's this de facto power at the grassroots everywhere in the world. If people want to make decisions about what they're producing, how they make decisions about land, how we're going to address issue X or Y, in most parts of the world, they're able to make those decisions to some degree without, let's call it, outside interference or state interference or interference by the private sector. One of the challenges in our discourse around the term democracy is that we start with the assumption of what we're talking about is representative democracy based on voting. This is like a more modern kind of thing. And of course, with the social democracy of like the nation state, this is kind of like an assumption that this is where democracy is at work. But what I encourage us to think more deeply about is that, power is not necessarily only situated in these kind of like formal governance structures. Of course, that's an important terrain of battle. Yeah, we've seen it all over the US, in Pennsylvania as a swing state, and across, kind of like the East Coast as a contested terrain. But the democratic infrastructure is there, and where it's not there, we can certainly build it. And then the other question about my involvement as, this white guy who grew up in small town, York County, Pennsylvania. So whenever I'm working with my comrades in different communities around the world, and I've had the privilege to work with many amazing and people way more powerful than myself. I come as an aggrieved person, maliciously afflicted by the empire that maliciously raised me. I come from, a family of evangelicals where going into the military is sort of like celebrate. It's very praised and celebrated, and to be nationalistic is praised and celebrated, right? So this is like a community that has affected me negatively. I could have, taken the path of maybe some of my cousins or something and just bought into it and, don't ask any questions, stay in line, get your rewards later in life. But that would have hurt me, it would have hurt my heart and my life. So I come with the belief that our liberation is bound together simply because we're facing a similar system of oppression, not a similar system, but actually the same system. It might affect us differently. We might have disparities in my privilege or your privilege. That's a very complicated discussion. But fundamentally, there are a handful, like we can count them almost on our few fingers. There are a handful of billionaires in the world that control so much about our life. So if we sort of look at it with any sense, we're in the same boat, yeah? Our boats are a little different, but we're in the same boat, yeah? And if we can meet at that kind of level and build trust and talk about how our lives have been, like the wounds we have incurred as a result of the systems that are bad, the hope that we see because we were able to make a tough decision and try to make a change in the world, this is where we really meet. So, there's a lot of learning that I've had to do about like when to step forward and assert myself, when to, step back, when to encourage others, when to support them. That conversation gets extremely nuanced, and it's all kind of like contextual, and there are often not, clear yes or no kind of black and white answers. But of course, that's a question that like we all have to hold as we meet other people and realize that we're in the same boat together. It's like, what do I bring to this? If it's privilege, how can I weaponize that privilege for constructive purposes? So we can also talk about that, maybe a sidebar sometime. I have a lot of stories. And, if you're interested in, blunders, we can also find some of those stories too.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, guys. Does anybody mind cutting in? All right, I just have actually one final question, which is when is the film going to be ready about Dr. Stella? And when it is ready, would you be willing to come back to Penn State and screen it?
Ooh.
Yeah, so the film, I mean, we're gonna start editing in March, and we're hoping by end of year we will be able to screen it, to have a premiere or something. But I think we will have a lot of screenings around here because we are fiscally sponsored by Women Make Movies, and they do usually help with a lot of, you know, screenings, especially in North America. They will help a lot. But we're also in conversation with a lot of people who are interested in like impact campaigns with the film. And we already, I mean, we pitched the film in Geneva, and we already had like universities and organizations that wanted to just, you know, have a screening. And it might even be possible to bring Dr. Stella as well to be involved and talk to your class or something. So yeah, there's so many possibilities, I think.